So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next panel. My name is Petra JANTZER. I am a Senior Managing Director of Accenture, and I'm leading our global life sciences practices, serving biopharma and medtech clients across the world. Sue DESMOND-HELLMANN unfortunately has to excuse herself for today, so I'll have the pleasure and the honor to be with this panel for the next hour, and I look very much forward to a discussion. Let me introduce our esteemed panelists for today. We have Mr. Rob Davis, CEO and Chairman of Merck & Co. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
We have Dr. Giovanni CAFORIO, who is the Chairman and CEO of BMS, Bristol Squibb. Very pleased to have you here. Thank you for making the time today. And then last but not least, Dr. YANCOPOULOS, if I pronounce it correctly, hopefully, Chief Co-founder, President, Chief Scientific Officer of Regeneron. So welcome, everybody, and maybe a quick hands for our panelists. So today, what we're going to discuss is a reflection on looking back, and actually how fantastic is it, I should say, being here a year after last year's mixed virtual in-person panel for the main panel actually for the Galien event here. And seeing so many people back in the room is absolutely fantastic. And, you know, you get the vibrance back in New York. So it was really just good to be back here again and sort of see that life is coming back to a normal. We do want to reflect today a little bit about the learnings actually coming out of COVID. And last year we had a really good discussion about how COVID and the circumstances around COVID has really worked as an accelerator for the industry, and you know, many things were made possible within a very short time frame. Now, today I want to kick off actually the panel with a quick reflection from each of you around what are actually some of the gaps that COVID has made very obvious and apparent, and you know. I'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to maybe highlight, you know, your one or two top gaps that you're seeing, and then we'll sort of go a little bit deeper as we progress through the hour.
I guess I'll jump in and then hear from the rest of the folks. You know, as we looked at what was happening in the pandemic, I think one of the things that, and it's not surprising now, I guess it was surprising going into it, is really the health inequities that still exist. And how we were seeing those play out across all elements of our business, whether it was in, obviously, getting people the vaccine is one whole sphere of this. But then if you look even in, you know, the normal areas we would have been operating in our oncology business, in our business to bring vaccines, the regular vaccine portfolio to the public, you saw the real impact by the fact that we weren't able to get to every segment of society the way we should. And that, I think, is probably, for us, has been a big learning. We're thinking about that now as we think about how to approach our clinical studies. I think we have to start at the clinical phase. And so we're very active now in trying to be much more deliberate and intentional in how we're engaging on the clinical front. But then equally, it's about helping people understand what is out there, how do you educate? You know, one of the interesting things we learned, vaccine hesitancy and confidence, the disparity you saw across different minority groups. Mm-hmm. We're investing now quite heavily to start doing education sessions to help people understand the importance of vaccinations and to give them confidence in the system, not only in the vaccine, you can put almost the vaccine aside, in the system itself. And that's something we've been very focused on. I don't know.
Well,
topic, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into the health equity issues as we continue the conversation.
I'll just build on what Rob was saying. So from our perspective, things that we observed was, for example, even patients with very serious diseases not going to look for healthcare and seeing their physician anymore. And so we intervened by starting a number of educational campaigns, for example, to have patients with atrial fibrillation continue to go and see their physicians for prevention of stroke, because we had seen a drastic decrease in the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation, and that was obviously very concerning. We looked at discontinuity in care driven by loss of jobs and people losing their insurance. And when you look at the population of patients that lost their coverage and were at risk of stopping therapy, there was a disproportionate representation of minorities. So as an example, we intervened very quickly and made medicines available for free to anybody that had lost a job during the pandemic. And then, of course, it highlighted the importance of looking at diversity in clinical research, and the findings during the COVID period actually accelerated our efforts in ensuring diversity in clinical trial and inclusive research, and we can talk about that later.
Going in a completely different direction. The most important thing that we should have learned, and unfortunately I don't think we've learned it and it hasn't stuck enough, is that all of this is meaningless except for one thing, that we as a society have to be investing even a lot more in the science, innovation, and the technologies that allowed us as a species to fight back against an existential threat. And it's amazing to me how so many people think, oh, these things happen by accident. If there hadn't started in academia a lot of the basic science that started the ability to make these mRNA-type vaccines or the antibody technologies such as the ones that we used, let alone then companies and the capital systems allowed for investment in early-stage companies that never dreamed of saving the world from a pandemic, but were developing these for other reasons, the system worked to the degree that we were ready as a community, the biopharma community, to fight back and literally save the world. But we could not have done it. It was not that people accelerated, and I think that this is sort of a little bit of a myth. Oh, they responded. No, yeah, everybody worked 24/7 because we all felt that it was our duty and our obligation, but we were building on everything that had been built before. And we have to recognize that there are many existential threats beyond health and disease that we face as a species, and we are not recognizing that with all these concerns, and all due respect, yes, we have to worry about equity and access and all these things, but if you don't have the cures, if you don't have the technology, you have nothing to share and to deliver and to make equitable. And we as a society aren't learning that lesson. I think it's a crime against humanity that here we just went through an era where the damage in financial terms was in the trillions, let alone devastation in terms of loss of life and illness and so forth. And yet we think to try to prevent trillions in damage and so much loss of life, we can invest $30 billion a year in the NIH, and then we are not recognizing that we should be, what should we be accelerating? The incentives and so forth for innovation to happen both in the academic setting but also in the private sector. And those are the most important lessons I think we need to learn. We have to do a much better job of communicating. There will be no cures. There will be no solutions to any of the problems that literally threaten our species unless we invest a lot more in science, technology, and innovation. It has to start at the earliest levels, and it has to go through, all the systems that I was just talking about.
Thank you very much, George. I think this is a fantastic segue into a couple of topics that you raised. I do want to come back to the being ready with innovation. And we've also seen with COVID, working in innovation ecosystems and working together is critically important. Giovanni, maybe I can ask you around your view on innovation ecosystems and the play together of internal, external innovation, academic innovation. How do you look at the importance of this to fuel the growth of the industry going forward, and what is BMS actually doing around this?
Well, I think it's critical. You look at our companies, I think about Bristol Myers Squibb. We invest over $11 billion a year in research and development. It's 12,000 scientists around the world. It's a very significant commitment to innovation. At the same time, It's just a very small part of what happens around the world. So if we don't think about innovating by collaborating with academia, with biotech, with our peer companies, we are never going to be able to move at the right speed. So what are we doing about it? I think if you look at Bristol Myers Squibb in the last 3 to 5 years, we have fundamentally transformed the R&D organization and strategy. Our R&D research centers today are strategically located in areas where the ecosystem of innovation is thriving, where there is academic excellence, where there are other biotechs, where there are other companies. We are obviously in Cambridge and Seattle and San Francisco, San Diego, other parts of the world where we find that ecosystem. The second thing that we do is we actually look at strategic partnerships as part of our R&D strategy. We make significant investments in small companies that need funding, that need expertise, that need support. We develop long-term partnerships with them. We have over 300 of those collaborations ongoing right now, and they are an integral part of the way we think about advancing our science, advancing our pipeline. Our scientists actually have objectives for internal productivity. They have specific objectives for external innovation brought into the company, because they have to think about that not as competing with their programs, but complementary to their programs to help them accomplish their objective faster. So that wasn't necessarily the case a few years ago, and we've really tried to accelerate a fundamental shift in mindset in terms of external versus internal innovation that then obviously translates into the way you allocate capital, resources, and you think about the evolution of your research strategy.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. We'll come back to the question what the industry can probably do more collectively. But looking at some of the recent development, Rob, with how do you look at the impact of the U.S. pricing framework actually on the ability of the industry, which is currently driven by market-driven research, pricing, and demand to some extent. How do you look at the impact of that? Is the Inflation Reduction Act actually, has that crossed the line for the industry, or is it actually?
Yeah. Well, if you look at it, and maybe it builds on what George was saying in his answer to the earlier question, it is about, do you promote an environment that supports investment and innovation, and an understanding that what all of us do is take risk, big risk, that takes years to play itself out. So, we're always trying to understand, do we have the right structure to make sure we can drive the right return on investments to continue to bring capital into our industry so we can invest. And as you look at what the Inflation Reduction Act has done, parts of it, and I'll speak for Merck, I won't speak for the industry, but parts of it we were very supportive of. What it did around rethinking Medicare Part D, we very much were in favor of, because it did what we believed is the issue. It helped address out-of-pocket cost. And that was by putting a cap on out-of-pocket costs, eliminating the donut hole. So from that perspective, we very much supported that. Frankly, we wish they had done more in that regard. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it was about $200 billion is what the industry committed over 10 years. $300 billion if you include the elimination of the rebate rule. But just even if you think of it from the $200 billion, only $30 billion approximately is going to this reformation of Medicare Part D. The rest of it went to fund other parts of the government unrelated to health care. So, that's something that I think as an industry we need to keep driving for more investment in the reduction of out-of-pocket costs and protecting innovation. And in that spirit, the one part of the Inflation Reduction Act that is worrisome is now the fact that they have what was termed negotiation, which frankly isn't negotiation, it's price setting. After a period of time, 9 years if you're a small molecule, 13 if you're large. And I can tell you for us, in the near term, the Inflation Reduction Act isn't going to affect our business that much. But strategically, long term, both our business and the industry, I do think it's going to have a chilling effect, because it's changing the way you have to think about how you invest in discovery development, It's changing the way you think between large and small molecule. I'll give one example. I know Giovanni shares this with me because we've talked about this. Think about how cancer drugs are developed. It tends to be that you find an area where you say, I believe I have a hypothesis. I will go to where I can prove it the fastest. That's often in the smallest tumor types, not areas, frankly, that you're doing to make money, but you're trying to prove the effect. Once you prove it, you then do subsequent studies to broaden it, extend it, deepen it. If you look for our drug, Keytruda, we're now almost, it launched in 2014-ish, about halfway through its life. We're less than halfway through the development program. I don't know if in the future you'll be able to do that where you keep investing in follow-on indications, and that concerns me because patients who have those needs could be hurt, or frankly, those smaller indications up front. As a pharma company, you very well might say, I can't go after those, I can't make my money there, so I'm going to have to go for the bigger opportunity down the road. However that ends up playing itself out, there will be losers in future patients who are going to be held back from getting the innovation they need. So as an industry, I think that's what we have to deal with, and that's going to take ongoing education and discussion to make sure that we go after what we should be doing, lowering costs for patients, not putting dampers on innovation.
Thank you, Rob. George, maybe we bring it together on the one hand and take maybe a 5-year perspective or so. You made a very strong statement to, we need to have the science in place, but now we have some headwinds around, how we finance that. So if you look the next years ahead, what are you predicting is going to happen to the industry's innovation model and business model?
Wow, that's a hard ask. I just have to say I agree with a lot of the comments that Giovanni and Rob in particular just made about we have to have policies that support and drive and don't actually hinder and prevent innovation. Innovation is not just at the discovery level, it's also at the drug development level and expansion of indications and so forth. So that's really critically important. That said, and like I said, nothing is more important than communicating how much we spend, what we do, and how we have to actually increase the incentives to allow us to be able as a community to invest more and more. But I am still very optimistic and hopeful. I mean, I think that we are entering into, and I think many of us, many in this room, probably feel we're entering into another golden period. I think that, from my perspective, some of the most exciting advances of the last decade or so had to do with advances that molecular biology brought in terms of biologicals and antibodies and those sorts of breakthroughs that have really now become some of the most important medicines that are changing the practice of medicine. I think they will continue. Biologicals as a class will continue to make change. But I do think that we're just about entering into the era of genetic medicines, which are going to bring a whole nother, hopefully, opportunity to really change how we attack disease. May or may not know, everybody talks about CRISPR. We had, together with our collaboration with Intelli, the first successful situation where we systemically went into human beings and changed a pathological gene to correct it. And we've now shown, as would have been predicted from the science, that those corrections are lasting for long periods of time. So you can literally maybe cure diseases by using genetics-based approaches in medicines. And I think many of us are in these areas and getting in these areas and very excited about these areas. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see that these are going to become more real. They're going to be changing more, having more impact and coming closer and closer to really becoming something that is not just niche, dealing with a few patients here and there, but more broadly impacting disease.
And with that, also fundamentally address some of the health economic burden. I mean, if you can really cure, it's a very different fundamental approach to addressing this topic. I would like us to...
I do want to comment about that, health economic burden. We all know that it's increasing on so many levels. I think that, and this just astounds me how the innovators are the ones who are sort of saddled with the problems and blamed in part for the health economic burden, as opposed to realizing how much industry outside of biopharma is actually causing the problem. You know, we're not the companies that are literally selling poison like high fructose corn syrup to children, okay, or polluting the planet with plastics, or, you know, things like the famous Apple phone, which is designed to cause addictive behavior that results in obesity, sedentary behavior, all sorts of neuropsychiatric disorders and so forth. We have to recognize that literally there are industries that are causing this incredible health economic burden. And I think that what we should be doing, instead of looking at disincentivizing the innovators who are trying to address this incredible burden, maybe we should be having some of the people who are causing all these problems, some of the biggest companies on the planet, maybe they should help carry this burden and actually contributing to the solutions.
Yeah. I think we could spend the rest of the panel just debating that question. So thank you very much. But I fundamentally agree very much. It's calling for policy and, you know, taking actually a broader look instead of a very fragmented niche look. I would like to turn to the topic that the two of you actually raised when we talked about the gaps that became very apparent during the pandemic, and talk about health equity and diversity and inclusion. It's a topic that is very, very close to my heart personally, and a topic that I'm very engaged with. And I would like to start off with, back to you, George, and I give you another provocative question. Why does it even matter?
Well, I do think, obviously, for so many reasons, we should be very deliberately and intentionally trying to deal with these issues. But I do think that there's a big advantage in businesses where science really drives the business and you let science drive the business, in that you can address these issues much more organically and naturally. And what do I mean by that? We all know the beauty of science. If you really are true and stick to the science, it's all about the data. It's all about being objective. Science does not discriminate. Science does not have biases. And frankly, it's innate in the scientific process that we need to search for diversity, because that empowers the actual science. And there's many very specific examples. We all know the more diversity of opinions and thoughts, you end up with a better idea. But in the actual conducting of the actual science, as you may know, we are the largest human sequencers in the world. We've sequenced almost half of all human beings who've actually been sequenced, have been sequenced at Regeneron. And why do we do this? Because we believe, and we've already proved it, that there is genetic variation that will actually predict either causation or cure of disease. We all know this. There are literally genetic superheroes that walk amongst us that are resistant to pain, that are resistant to heart disease, that are super strong. These people literally exist, and all of these led to actual drug programs for us at Regeneron. And what we all realize is that, you know, to find these X-men and women, you have to look long and wide and far and search for as much genetic diversity as you can. So this is why when we do our sequencing projects, we now have the largest collection of sequencing of African populations, Asian populations. We have major sequencing programs with Pakistan, Taiwan, all sorts of other countries in Asia. South American programs. We have the largest sequencing database of Mexican populations. And so you can do it, and you should do it deliberately and intentionally. But if you follow the science demands that you do these things, that you don't just sequence, you know, European populations, but you sequence broadly and widely and find as much as diversity as you can, because that's going to empower you. And then, of course, that's going to deliver, of course, to these people also eventually the medicines are going to have the biggest impact on them based on their genetics. So I think that's the beauty of following the science. The science will actually demand in and of its own that we do the right thing. and we deliver in that way.
Yeah, and with the rise of genetics, genomics, certainly that diversity will be more explored. However, if you look at the reality today, if you look at clinical trials, there is often not, the diversity there that's needed. Giovanni, maybe over to you on the clinical trial side, as well as also on the workforce side. And I've read a bit about sort of your values and the culture that you're promoting actually in BMS. Diversity inclusion is a very big topic. So would you share with us your reflections on diversity in clinical trials, but also diversity in the workforce? Why is it important? What are the benefits? What is BMS doing?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's a big topic, and I think what I would start to say is that there are many dimensions, of course, to inclusion and diversity. And I really like to talk about it in that order. So the issue of diversity in clinical trials for me goes back to, if we develop an innovative medicine, we need to make sure we develop it with information we need in order to understand its efficacy in the population that suffers from that disease. And then when the medicine is available, it needs to be accessible and available to everyone. And so, unfortunately, that's not the case. And we looked at how do you improve the diversity of research efforts and the diversity of patients in clinical trials. And the reality is there are many biases. We found that when in fact a diverse investigator is the investigator for a trial, that person has a better opportunity of developing a relationship of trust with diverse patients that want to get into that clinical trial. So the BMS Foundation, as an example, initiated a program which is the Dr. Wynn Diversity in Clinical Trial Award Program. I know that it was mentioned this morning, where we have made a commitment through our foundation, and now other foundations have joined, to actually support the development of the next generation of clinical trial investigators that commit to working in geographic areas in the US where there aren't a lot of clinical trials today. I think that's going to be really impactful. The second thing that we did is we committed to actually placing a certain percentage of our clinical trials in areas where we can more easily access minority population, diverse groups of patients that are not typically involved in clinical trials. The other thing we did, which
Can I just quickly come in here, because we also heard earlier this morning, there is often actually in these communities a lack of infrastructure, lack of sites, lack of investigators. How do you think about addressing
Well, I think that developing investigator cohorts is part of the solution to that. But of course, you need interventions in terms of healthcare infrastructure to make sure that the medicine alone, without the infrastructure, obviously, is not going to be helpful. So the one thing where we linked this topic to the other question you asked me, which is about diversity in the workforce, we actually asked our employee groups to get involved in diversity in clinical trials. And so, for example, one of our groups, which is called BOLD at Bristol Myers Squibb, which is the group of our Black employees, they actually started a project. We gave them some funding, and they started looking at what are the barriers for inclusion in clinical trials, and they developed a set of solutions which we are now applying. And so we used those ideas in one of our prostate clinical trials, for example, with Opdivo, and we were able to increase dramatically the representation, diverse representation in that specific clinical trial. So you can put your internal talent at work to think about how to impact diversity in clinical trials. I think internally, we've made a very clear decision. We established bold objectives. So by the end of this year at BMS, we want to have 50% of our executives globally to be women. And we've set a 3-year goal to double representation of Black, Latinx, and Latinx executives in the company. And we think that's really important because it's going to create a more diverse company where what George was saying, different points of view around the table will be leading to better business outcomes.
Thank you. also you, Rob, mentioned it's a critical topic for Merck. This morning we heard also aspects of, lack of education, lack of trust fundamentally in participating in clinical trials at all. Are these relevant topics for you, or any other hurdles, aspects that you are seeing and addressing on this important topic?
Well, a lot of what we're doing is actually very, very similar to the way Giovanni laid it out, what's happening at Bristol Myers. It starts with, one, you need to be in the communities. So it starts with, like what they're doing, we are making sure we are putting our study sites into the communities or in sites that we know support underrepresented communities so that we can start to bring people in. In addition to that, we work to try to make sure, understanding that there's obviously, you can't do an investigation if you don't have an investigator. It was to your infrastructure comment you made. And so we're working to try to make sure how we can support training, education, and support of the investigators themselves to make sure we have a population that we can go to. And then the other aspect of it, we actually are in a study called the IMPACT study for increasing patients into clinical studies around cancer. And this is really looking at why is it that in underrepresented populations, even if there is a study, they don't participate. Often it can be a dollar issue, dollar and cents. They just don't have the money to travel. They don't have the ability to participate. So in those cases, we provide funding. It's education at times. So we actually have boots on the ground who are in the communities helping to do education. We found in some places, you go into Hispanic communities, there's a distrust of people from the outside, especially if you don't speak the language. So you need local people who speak the language, who are engaging, because it's mainly trust is what you're trying to build. So we're doing it at all elements, trying to drive this. And then, I agree with it's, obviously we need to do it in how we study the drugs, but then we need to make sure the access is representative of the communities we serve as well. And so we're very focused on that aspect of it as well, and have put in place some very specific programs to go after that. And then all of that feeds right back into how we look at the makeup of the population within the company. If our senior management is not representative, it's hard to attract people. And if you don't have people who bring life experience that are representative, then you'll never understand why you can't get through these barriers. So we're very focused on that. Similar targets to increase women in leadership, African American, Black individuals into leadership, Hispanic, Latinx into leadership, which are some of the areas that we need to do better.
I think it's really important to point out that we can't lose sight of the fact that general problems with access disproportionately affect the disadvantaged. So we all know that the poorest 10 to 20% socioeconomically account for something incredibly disproportionate, like 80 to 90% of the healthcare burden. We know, for example, we saw this with COVID, that there was an incredible disproportionate burden upon these groups. And that means that they are more affected by the general access problem. And I just want to highlight two, I think disastrous examples where general problems then have this disproportionate effect. So in the case of COVID, as many of you know, we developed, not only us, companies like Lilly, AstraZeneca, developed very effective antibody treatments that really could have prevented 80 to 90% of hospitalizations and deaths due to COVID. We together collectively provided millions of doses to the United States government. The United States government decided that it was too complicated a message to the American people to explain to them that you should get vaccinated. But if you're sick, there's actually an effective treatment that could save your life 80 to 90% of the time. That message never got out. Most of those doses were never delivered. Who suffered most disproportionately? The exact groups that we're talking about that by diversity and inclusion programs we want to be protecting. So it's general programs that if we don't solve these access problems more generally, it's the same thing. For example, I have to say, this is something that to me also highlights where the problem is. Our industry, companies like us and Amgen, delivered, I think, one of the greatest drugs in the history of heart disease, which is the #1 killer still in America. Disproportionately affects who? The same people that we're talking about that we should be most concerned about. I actually believe that tens of millions of people, I personally take a PCSK9 inhibitor because I believe all the data that it really will dramatically decrease your potential risk of having heart disease. I think these should be made widely available. The payer system has decided otherwise, limited to very few people. Who disproportionately suffers from this? Who has disproportionately higher rates of heart disease and so forth? And so it's these general problems that will disproportionately harm the highest at-risk populations that we should be more concerned about how to deal with.
Yeah, and maybe if we take it one step further, thank you for that, expand from the underprivileged populations in our Western world and talk a bit about global health. Because that also during the pandemic, and not only during the pandemic, but the pandemic highlighted one more time that there are massive global health issues. And also it's become very apparent that, the solution can only lie in, all the stakeholders in the system sort of working better together. Now, again, this is a big question, but my question to you is, Rob, maybe starting with you, what can the industry, the biopharma industry, do to help address some of these foundational global health problems?
I think some of it starts with understanding that the way we bring access with our medicines to the world is it's not a monolithic approach. It's a market by market issue. In some cases, what you're facing is you don't have an infrastructure. I mean, we could carry the same theme through that George was saying in the United States with what happened with the monoclonals. How many doses of vaccines were destroyed globally because you delivered them to the docs of a country, but there's no way to get it to the actual physician to administer the vaccine. So, what we did in our own case with our antiviral Lagevrio, before we actually even knew we had a drug that worked, we already had developed an access strategy. We'd reached out to several potential generic companies to be voluntary licensees. We got them lined up. We started to work with them on the manufacturing to make sure the capabilities were there and that they could run the studies they needed to run, such that once we knew we had a drug that was effective, they were all ready to go. And then from there, we initially donated first to USAID 2 million courses of drug to accelerate care to the most desperate of countries around the world, the lowest of the low middle income countries. As we brought up those voluntary licensees, we also did a deal with the Medicines Patent Pool to extend access, and we put in place tiered pricing tied to the market such that we knew the markets that could afford to pay based on both what the profitability of the country was and the need, it would be shared. And I think, I feel very proud about what we did and how fast we were able to give access. That's one example. I will tell you in oncology, it's a very different situation. We're more and more now, it's not a price question, it is an infrastructure. So for instance, in India now, we're actually working actively, and I give a lot of credit to the head of emerging markets at Merck. He had it's such a simple thing, but he said to his team, rather than grow revenue for Keytruda, grow access. And oh, by the way, if you grow access, you're probably going to grow revenue. One does not necessarily mean the other. If you get access, you will get revenue. If you go just for revenue, you might make decisions that don't optimize access. And by challenging his team that way, they brought forward a whole host of creative ways. In India, they said, we see a couple challenges. The biggest challenge for kind of the middle group is they'll pay it, they just don't have the cash flow. And so we said, well, what if we give interest-free loans? We'll eat the interest for them, and we'll help them absorb by spreading the cash over time. That was one area. In another area, it was focusing on they didn't have the infrastructure. Well, what if we helped to invest into the infrastructure? And so it was a fact by fact, situation by situation, always with the mindset of driving access. And that's something I'm trying to really drive now at Merck. is how do we think differently? Access is core to sustainability. And if we do access right, frankly, a lot of the challenge and the ill will that comes to the industry will change, because I think that is what people generally react to is it's nice you have great drugs, but not if they don't reach the patient. No. And that's what we're really focused on.
Yeah, so very optimistic view on increasing access and a lot of efforts there. Yeah. Giovanni, maybe a question to you. There is actually criticism that access is fine, but you're not covering with your portfolio actually certain diseases that millions and millions and millions of people in poor countries actually suffer from. What's your perspective on that? What's your answer to that criticism?
Well, I think that the answer as always is there's multiple areas of intervention. Of course, one of the things that is important is really looking at epidemiology of diseases. I think it's important to recognize that for any of our companies, in order to have a real impact on global health, we have to have deep expertise in that therapeutic area. So, you know, in our case at Bristol Myers Squibb, for example, with very, very strong presence and knowledge we have in oncology, where we can start from is look at, you know, what are, for example, the types of cancers that are more prevalent in some parts of the world, because, you know, the distribution across multiple different cancers in Asia, very different from the United States. And so we now are looking at developing development strategies that are more focused on specific geographies, and we have a clear program for Asia where we've prioritized diseases that are not prioritized for a global portfolio. I think that's the first point. The second point, which I think it's important, is building infrastructure. And Rob referenced that, you know, we have a commitment to pediatric oncology at Bristol Myers Squibb as an example. We have a long history of presence in sub-Saharan Africa. When we went and looked at what's happening in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of children diagnosed with cancer die before they have access to therapy. 80% of children with cancer in the United States are cured. And we don't think that's possible. But simply developing, that's acceptable. Simply developing a medicine and delivering a medicine would not be effective. So our foundation made a $100 million commitment, a multi-year program with Baylor College of Medicine. We're actually investing in building a network of hospitals and treatment centers. We've had to intervene and support the training of the first pediatric oncologist ever in some of those countries. Now, 3 years later, we've treated thousands of patients. So these are just two examples of how you can impact determinants of global health at different levels. And I think that every company can contribute depending on our scientific expertise, our know-how, the therapeutic areas in which we have a portfolio, but there's a lot we can do.
George, what can science do? Or whatever else you wanted to add.
I do want to add that if you follow the science, and Giovanni sort of said, if you have a science that can apply to a disease, if you follow that recipe, it can, I think, all work out. So let me just remind you, you know, one little story, which I think is a great story. As of 2014, antibodies had never been used to actually treat an infectious disease. And so, infectious viral disease, there was an Ebola breakout. Our scientists realized that, hey, maybe we could use antibodies. They should work. They should be able to bind the virus and prevent it from infecting other cells in the human being. So they worked at jet speed to address the Ebola outbreak in the Congo that was occurring in the mid-teens. And sure enough, very rapidly, they produced the first ever approved antibody cocktail that it literally is a cure for Ebola. I mean, think how crazy it is. We've all seen movies like this. And when we did that, and this harkens back to what I said in my very first point, when we were doing that, we weren't thinking about making a nickel or a dime. We were just thinking that the science could really help here. It could make a difference. It could cure Ebola. And it cured Ebola. And then what happened? Ebola never came to America. We didn't think it was going to come to America. We weren't doing it to protect Americans from Ebola. We just thought it could do something for this outbreak in the Congo. Then COVID hit. We had built the entire capability to fight Ebola, we were able within 6 months to produce an antibody cocktail to cure COVID. And that just shows that if you follow the science and you don't think too hard about the future commercial possibilities and so forth, you can't predict all that anyway. But if you follow the science and you stay true to the science and you say, hey, we can make a difference. It's in the Congo, it's a few thousand people, we'll never make any money off it. But the learnings from that science and that application now can have much broader capabilities and so forth to help more people, but also maybe to result in an investment return for the company. So following the science, I think, always can get you in a non-biased, discriminatory way to really helping lots of people.
So very optimistic notions here, from science to access to having the right portfolio. So we'll all be eagerly watching the progress that the industry is making actually in addressing these global health issues. I'm conscious that we'll have to have a little bit of time for questions. I have one more question, so people in the room, get ready. This is a rare opportunity to have these brilliant leaders available for your questions. Before we get to the questions, and coming back to the science, I am a scientist myself, but a very big believer that we are now entering a new era where science and technology is converging and is really becoming an accelerator for innovation and sort of transformation speed. And we talk about topics of, AI, and you have a view on the I in AI, machine learning, AI-driven discovery. We look at virtual trial arms in clinical trials, placebo in particular. We look at omni-channel approaches to create these hyper-personalized sort of stakeholder interactions. We look at digital twins in supply chain manufacturing. Now, where do you see the future? Where's the big opportunity here if we look at science and technology convergence? What will it do for our brilliant industry?
Yeah, some of it, all of the above, I think, to what you just said. But no, if you look at where we are spending our efforts right now, primarily it is in the labs, and it's less yet into the clinical space. In our view, the regulatory framework still makes doing too much in the clinical side of it possible. But in discovery, you think about what's the hardest thing. How do you take all of the information we have and find targets? How do you model, understand the composition of proteins? Our ability to use computers for 3D modeling, our ability to use machine learning to process data much quicker to help us identify targets. That's where we're spending a lot of time. I'll tell you an interesting area, and this was one that was surprising to me that our science brought to us, was, they said, as we look at where we have structured data going back, 50, 70 years, it's in safety. Because every time you do the tox work, that's always been data that's fairly structured, and we've done it consistently. How often have our scientists run experiments and killed a drug because they ultimately find a safety signal that, man, if they could have found that quicker and maybe found it virtually, we could have stopped the process much quicker. And the data is already there. It's structured in a way. So we're putting a lot of effort into thinking about it from the areas of safety and moving there. I think eventually it will move more into the clinical space. But then for us right now, the other area we're spending a lot of time is commercially. It's the omni-channel approach. But it is about value demonstration and how do we make sure that in a real-world setting that we can understand the effect the drugs are having and quickly feed that back into our discovery and development. So a lot of effort there. And then lastly, driving productivity across our manufacturing and automation is a big area. So it hit almost everything you mentioned, and we are investing in all of those areas.
Yeah, excellent. And quickly to the safety point, I attended the HEVA conference recently, and personally I do think there is a big opportunity for pre-competitive collaboration and sort of really leveraging that data across companies for the benefit of patients, and also leveraging more technology like federated learning and making sure we can all collaborate as an industry, respecting the privacy of the data. Giovanni.
I think you're seeing us agreeing on many, many important points. I fundamentally subscribe to what Rob just said. You know, I was told recently we are hiring more computer scientists than biologists in some part of the company these days. I think it's clear that all of the areas that Rob mentioned are very important, and there's no reason to choose one versus the other. Ultimately, I think our industry is all about innovation. So technology, if I had to artificially prioritize, I would say where we can make the most difference is by accelerating the translation of new science all the way into medicines. You know, obviously the discovery level is where you start, but we need to continue to push regulators to look at trials in a different way, to be able to use technology, real world cohorts that enable us, if anything else, if nothing else, to do smaller control arms and then duplicate that data with real world cohorts. There are multiple ways which, even with our current regulatory framework, technology can help accelerate new drug development. So I think it's important across the company where we create patient value and long-term value for shareholders is by being better and better bringing new medicines to market. So that's where it starts.
Absolutely. And maybe two quick remarks. In conversations, I mean, regulators seem very open, actually, to some of these approaches, even saying, running a placebo trial and placebo arm in a trial, is it even ethical if we have the data to sort of do a simulation around this? Of course.
I think if I may just add one point, if you don't mind, because going back to George's comments at the beginning, to me, I think it's absolutely fantastic that we have been able to develop a vaccine for COVID or an antibody for COVID in 6 months. I also believe it built on several years of fundamental research. But why should we be telling a cancer patient they're going to have to wait 7 or 8 years for the development of the next medicine if we have the science in our labs available? Why shouldn't we be accelerating a cancer therapy with the same sense of urgency that we have used to accelerate a COVID vaccine? And I think that's where I am concerned that as we think about coming out of the period of acute crisis from COVID, there is a real concern we go back to the status quo and we get satisfied again with the timelines of before.
We come full circle back to where we started, learnings from COVID. A quick 1-minute answer, if possible, from you on the science and technology convergence.
If you hadn't gathered, I'm a little bit of a contrarian.
That's why I'm giving you the 1 minute.
Everybody is going, I think, is usually not the right place to go yourself. In the case of AI, as Petra said, I object to the I in AI. There is no intelligence there, okay? That's what it is for human beings. I call it sort of the peanut butter and chocolate thing. A computer will never figure out that it's a good idea to put peanut butter together with chocolate. Every great invention and idea that I've been associated with, there is nothing right now about computational technology that can come close to coming up with any of those ideas. That said, I'm a big believer in machine learning.
And notice I use machine learning and not AI because
I was going to give you credit for that. And you also said something that's really important that a lot of people don't recognize, which is why you went to the safety direction, that you need lots, very large databases with well-structured data in order to do machine learning. And unfortunately, in our fields, there is not so much of that. Let me just tell you, it's going to be a long time before I'm going to trust any non-placebo controlled trial of any drug. So that could be another hour discussion. Yeah. People are really going off base there. Okay, but I do think what you need is you do need to create in the healthcare space these large, well-structured databases to do the machine learning, which could be an adjunct to true intelligence and innovation. We totally believe in that, and that's why we invest so much. As I said, in sequencing, we are creating because, it hasn't been done. We're collaborating with actually the rest of the biopharma industry and the UK Biobank. We sequenced the UK Biobank. We've sequenced millions of people now, all of them linked to detailed electronic records which we're turning into exactly this well-structured format, which we can then hopefully all be using, whether it's to design clinical trials or whether it's to find and validate a target. And I agree with you that a lot of this is pre-competitive, which is why we've engaged with a lot of our biopharma partners to fund for the first sequencing in the UK Biobank, and now the subsequent expansion of that to 5 million, plus our separate, 10 million, person effort. So we believe in it, but everybody should always recognize, as with every one of these fads and so forth, there's a little bit too much hype and over-promising in it. And in order to really get it to work, you're going to need both a lot of investment into finding either the data that already exists or creating the big data structured sets that we need to take advantage of it. And then you're going to still need, I see this for a long time, human beings to really understand how to take advantage of it and to be truly innovative and creative. And I think that's good news to all of us humans in the room.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're looking forward to the perfect collaboration between the genius scientists and the great algorithms help us make sense out of all of this information. So now we have, I think this watch over there tells me 4 minutes, 30 seconds, but we can probably be a little bit more generous on this. So I please request you, when you have a question, state your name, your affiliation, and also if the question is targeted to a specific panelist, please say so. 4 minutes 14, who is up?
Mina Abadir, assistant company called Biotech Gate, which puts partnerships between clinical trials as well as business and development. I totally agree with you, Dr. YANCOPOULOS, everything you said. I've been in the industry for about 27 years. I'm not going to mention all the large pharma I worked through, and it's the whole realm. And I worked through all the clinical trials from phase 1 to 4. The issue, I also did the commercializations and alliances, and now I'm also assisting venture capital do due diligence. The issue, I think, is the system itself needs to be revamped, whether it's the venture capital or corporate venture capital or accelerators, everything, even the trials themselves are not set to the patient. It's everybody's working in silos. Even the federal government is working in silos on that. My question is, how do you put a new realm or a paradigm together to make this effective? Because everybody's working through their own, you mentioned therapeutic areas, companies having the specific therapeutic areas, AI. I also worked in the multi-omics space with the precision medicine, and it doesn't work this way. And unfortunately, ex-US companies, I'm not going to mention each countries, but are more innovative than the US, and this is set for failure.
Excuse me to interrupt. So the question is, how do we make it happen?
How do you do that paradigm? Yes.
I think that's
Who is?
Well, I agree that we are too siloed, and I agree that having, as we've all said, more collaborative efforts. I do think, I am stunned when you talk about outside the US and inside the US, I am stunned at how the United Kingdom with the UK Biobank and that whole effort has been so much more successful than anything that we've been able to do here in America. How, if you think about it, we're talking about machine learning, how we don't have a national healthcare database that captures every piece of data that we have so that we know how every patient responds to every possible treatment and in a quantifiable way. Maybe we wouldn't have to do all the KEYTRUDA studies if we had captured the data of how many docs had tried KEYTRUDA, maybe for some cancers that that weren't yet indicated. I really think that is another crime against humanity. We have to figure out as a society how to do better, and part of it is not just us as companies, but as a society. Like I said, we got to invest more, I think, in the basic sciences, incentives for the whole ecosystem and so forth, but also, how could we not have a national healthcare database? Frankly, honestly, in the long run, much more important than healthcare for all. If they're linked, probably you get one, you'll get the other. But my point is, it's the information that's going to matter and matters right now so much for the future and for dealing with, the diseases and the problems in the future. And these are the things that we have to figure out. This comes back more to policy and so forth. Absolutely. We, for example, like I said, with our biopharma consortiums, we're trying to figure out how to create it on a smaller scale where we're dealing with millions. But we should have 300 million Americans in a national healthcare database tracking every single piece of their information. That would have enormous value in terms of helping all of us in a pre-competitive way deal with everything from clinical trial design to validating targets to finding new indications and so forth. That's something that we should be pushing, you know, our legislators to do. How could we be throwing all that information away?
Yeah,
It's
agree.
incredible.
And also coming back, Giovanni, what you said, the concern that we are reverting to pre-COVID and why can this not be the norm rather than the exception? And I guess there's also an ask to the industry to help create that platform for dialogue with the regulators to sort of create advancement here. There's another question there.
Yeah, hi, Tom Brakel, Federated Investors. George, following the science is a great idea. You know, I'm afraid that IRA is not going to let you in certain areas. And take Keytruda as an example. It's an IV drug, 34 accelerated approvals, right? 8 years since launch, including 16 dose adjustments. If you had an oral magic pill, an oral Keytruda, you would never now develop this because you're running out of time with the 9 years of period till price negotiations. And so you're actually skewing investments away from orals to biologics. And you wouldn't mind that, I'm sure. But you know, I think it's for the industry. I think it's a problem, and I'm not quite sure how to address it. We probably need to have a discussion with all stakeholders involved. But you know, I think it's a problem. I'm not quite sure what the answer is.
You alluded to that exactly
Yeah,
before.
no, what he just said is articulated is exactly the issue I was trying to highlight that we see, and I know Giovanni sees the same issue. You know, I can tell you at Pharma, we are talking about how do we engage, but I think it starts with education, because what was interesting in what we saw, people at the FDA didn't understand what was in the IRA. So you had people, you know, when we were on the phone with people from HHS, they're kind of saying, we're not sure what to do with this. And so, you know, there was good intention behind it, but I think a lot of unintended consequences. And so we need to start that education. But frankly, you need parties on the other side that are open to have that debate and dialogue. Right now, we're not as much in that situation. We need to find a way to bridge that gap. But I think in the near term, it's more about how do we make sure we affect first what is going to be the rulemaking that's put in place based on the legislation. That's near term. The legislation itself is not going to change over the next few years. So this is a longer term challenge. But frankly, I would ask, you know, Pharma, we're focused on this. Yeah. Everyone in the industry needs to raise their hand from the other aspects of the system and point these issues out. Because when we do it, they say, oh, this is just about money. Yeah. And when others do it, it can also get to what it is, which is also a patient issue.
So this conversation is broadcasted real time into the world. So everybody, all stakeholders, please sort of come to the table. Let's have a discussion for, you know, society and advancement of science and getting benefits out to the patients out there. Yep. So thank you very much. Great panel. Hands for our panel, please.
Thank you.